This is the Middle Earth Philosopher. So yeah, this one's going to be a long one, possibly because this one is about the philosophy of Turin. And now, if you know anything about the story of the children of Turin and also within the Silmarillion as well, you know that Turin is hella complicated. You know, there's a lot to dissect with this dude. Because not only that, but also people's perceptions of him as well. That in many ways I think is too simplistic, and other ways it can be right on the money. But regardless, we're going to get into it. To begin with, I think there's a lot of similarities actually between Turin and Nienor in terms of their life experiences and people's perceptions of their motivations. So Turin is born during a time of long peace, one of the few that existed during the Beleriand Wars. And he's the first child to Hurin and Morwen. But because Hurin is gone a lot of the time, he takes more after his mother, including the long dark hair, which is usually associated with the Noldor, as well as some of her cold and distant mannerisms, though not as extreme as his mother's. Early on, the land of Dor-lómin is hit by a plague that kills a lot of the children in that region, which included his younger sister, Lilith, which starts a dramatic turn of events for Turin in terms of his personality. But after that, sometime later, the Battle of Number-Tears occurs, where he loses his father, who is presumed killed at that point, because he never comes back from the war. And thus Turin is put into living in hard times with his mother, trying to take care of her, as well as, growing up in the occupied land. And he is eventually forced to leave. And he doesn't want to leave his family. And yet he has to. His mother convinces him to just go. Because Doriath, which is where he's sent to, is considered one of the few safe places left in Beleriand at that time, since the Alliance is now pretty much dead, and the Noldor as an effective military force and political and military entity is gone. While he's in Doriath, he becomes a soldier, and he becomes a soldier of well-renown. He's well-respected among the Sindarin elves, and befriends actually Beleg, who is the captain of that particular army. And for a while, things seem to be going well for him. He's earning renown, he's getting battlefield experience, and still living. And he is maintaining consistent communication with his family still in Dor-lómin, even though it's occupied. So things seem to be going well for him until a point happens where communications stop. And Thingol, who almost considers him like a adopted son at this point, reluctantly decides not to send any more messengers because they're all getting killed, basically, because it's gotten that dangerous now. And this has another dramatic effect on Turin, which leads to a argument that happens at a dinner table, and he gravely wounds one of the elves, another elf noble, who then tries to kill him later on, but instead Turin accidentally kills him. And he decides to just leave and become a exile, basically. Even though he does find out that he was forgiven of it because it wasn't his fault, and that, Thingol and Beleg and everyone who cares about him in Doriath wants him to come back. And he just turns it down. From there, he eventually runs into a group of outlaws and basically takes command of them and turns them into a force to basically raid and loot travelers who are traveling down their paths. But after Beleg, who tracks him down, locates him and he is beaten, and Turin finds out about this, he swears off just beating anybody and tells his group that they're just going to attack orcs at this point, and nobody else. Humans and elves are not to be touched. And again, things are going well, but he is betrayed by Meme, who is one of the petty dwarves who was left over at this point, because Meme feels betrayed by Turin because Turin was a good friend to him and then started ignoring him when Beleg showed up, who joined their band. And the petty dwarves hate the elves, any elves. Arguably, they are the most prejudiced against the elves of any of the dwarven clans. And he decides that this cannot stand, so he betrays them, which leads to Turin's capture. Eventually, Turin is tracked down by Beleg, who survived, and he frees him from his orc captors, but then Turin kills him accidentally with Beleg's sword. And Turin suffers another loss, and is just grieving by this. But it's at this point that he encounters a elf who escaped or was released by Morgoth back into Beleriand named Gwyndor. And Gwyndor had been one of the soldiers who went to war during the Battle of Number Tiers, and in fact had been the leader of a charge that broke into Angband and actually forced Morgoth to release his reserves. And his whole group got killed except him. And he was captured and broken. And so now he's a completely different person than, what he was before. But he brings Turin to Nargothrond to heal and just to have a home, because he's homeless at this point. He has no one there. He has no one left at this point. And we have a rinse repeat again. He does well in Nargothrond, gains the respect of the people there because he is a great warrior. Because, mind you, Turin is considered the second best warrior among humans ever in Middle-earth, with his father only being the one better than him. So, he gains renown, and he becomes an advisor to the king of Nargothrond. And his stubbornness gets the better of him, as it often does. And he convinces the king that, Nargothrond, who had been avoiding going to direct war with Morgoth, especially after Unnumbered Tears, he convinces him that, hey, this sucks, we're strong enough now, we need to go to war with these guys and take them head on. Guess who that sounds like? His dad. And they build a bridge, and they start to engage Morgoth's forces in open battle. And again, at first they are successful. But Morgoth, who basically has a hit on Turin at this point because of what his father has been saying to him, sends Glaurung to lead an army down to destroy this army and Nargothrond, which Glaurung does. And Turin survives the battle, is not cursed by Gwyndor, but more or less he's just like, I never should have helped you. You're just a curse to everyone who knows you. Another wound to Turin, and he encounters after that Glaurung, who then places him under a spell instead of killing him, because Turin was going to try to kill him then. He was not afraid of the dragon, even though everyone else was, and for damn good reason. So while under the spell from Glaurung, he tells Turin that his mother and his sister are looking for him. And Glaurung's already encountered them. He's already deceived his sister under another spell that basically wiped her mind. So he's setting him up for Morgoth's curse to kind of work its effects and everything. And it forces Turin to choose between following after his family and rescuing one of the princesses of Nargothrond named Venduas, who was, as revealed by Gwyndor, to be the only way that Turin can escape fate that he was indirectly running towards. And Turin eventually chooses his family, of course. So from there, he tracks down, his family back to his old homeland of Dorloman, only to find out that he had been lied to, and that his mother and sister had left a long time ago. And realizing that he's been deceived, Turin just goes into a rage. He kills one of the Easterlings there, and then he's just forced to leave by the people, his own people, because he's just bringing trouble among them. Because now the Easterlings are going to punish the natives basically for this act that he did. So from this point, he tracks down Findulas using the skills that he learned during his time in Doriath. And he gets to her too late because she's already been killed. And this is where he runs into the Halidin, who basically take him in and, again, rinse and repeat. Things start to go well. He's respected for his military abilities, and he tries to hide from his name, which at this point he believes is the reason for, this curse. And he's thinking that, well, if he gives another name, the curse won't find him. And he falls in love with a woman who actually later on turns out to be his sister, Nienor, because of what Glaurung had done to her early on. And Glaurung later on is seen in approaching the lands of the Halidin. So Turin goes out to kill the dragon, and with one other person who also ends up dying by accident, eventually succeeds in mortally wounding Glaurung. But as he is just telling Glaurung off at this point because he has years of pent-up rage and frustration that he just needs to let out and vent, and he does that now, in front of this foe that armies of elves have not taken down, even though an army of dwarves almost did. Not going to disrespect that. But Turin is knocked out when some of Glaurung's poisonous blood falls on his hands, and he just falls into this kind of coma-like state, which his sister wife, Nienor, eventually finds him because she had, against his order, come out looking for him and found him in this state and thought that he was dead. In which Glaurung wakes up, tells him the truth of her relationship with her brother, and in horror and despair because she's also pregnant, kills herself by jumping into a ravine. Now, when Turin wakes up, he's told what happened by Brandir, one of the lords of the Halidin, who was also a rival of his because he was also in love with Nienor. And Turin can't handle it because Brandir basically tells him that, the curse has found you and you'll never escape it. And Turin falls into one of his mad rages and kills him and then runs off. And at this point, he is in such a deep despair and everything that he eventually goes off and he commits suicide because of the fate or bad luck that has just followed him throughout his entire life, or most of his life. And that's basically how his life ends. Now, like I said before, that's a lot. But having said all that, we again go to the question of the philosophies of Turin. And I think it's more poignant here than other people who I've talked about in other situations that I've talked about because of the inclusion of fate and how you want to interpret that or whatnot within that universe. So I'll delve into it now a little bit here. You see, even though Morgoth is a Valar, which by extension means that he has powers that exceed the physical, so to speak, and he does pronounce this curse on Turin's father, Hurin, and what's going to happen to his children, actively, from what I've read and everything, I'm not seeing a lot of elements at play where some mysterious force is forcing Turin's hand, so to speak. I can see maybe 2 or 3 times where you could argue that it was a hand of fate at work that was affecting Turin. One being the killing of Beleg by accident. The other happened to fall in love with his sister, who he didn't know was his sister. And even though Glaurung did set her up, there was no way that Glaurung would have known, or it said that did know, that was how things were going to play out. As far as he knew, she ran off naked somewhere, and that was that. So, under those circumstances, okay, maybe I can see an argument for fate at that point. But otherwise, honestly, I just see him making bad choices in his life. He is clearly given an option of changing his mind or choosing a different action, and no one is forcing him to do anything. In fact, no one can force him to do anything because, again, at that time, he is the greatest warrior of Middle-earth. Okay, he's only beaten, I think, once, and that was when he was captured by the orcs when they were betrayed by Meme. No one made him leave Doriath because they wanted him back. They tried to get him back. They almost begged for him to come back. He chose not to. He chose not to include Meme in his relationships when Beleg came to find him and he was staying with the outlaws. That was a conscious choice. He was told in Nargothrond that building the bridge was a bad idea and that it should not be done, and he chose to do it anyway because of his pride and his own arrogance. So I'm just seeing a lot here of him making bad choices rather than the hand of fate. And moreover, perhaps the biggest argument against that interpretation of fate, if you will, is the fact that Morgoth sent out Glaurung with a specific order to make sure it happens. Okay? He wasn't content to just leave it alone. He had to send out an agent, a hand of Morgoth, if you will, to ensure that this curse that he laid on Huron play itself out. And those are some of my issues, at least in a way, with the whole interpretation of fate being the reason for Turin's downfall, and a curse placed upon him by Morgoth, and even Turin blaming his misfortunes on his name and everything. Just like Gwendor said, I think it's a different way of interpreting it, but it's not the name that is the curse, but that is within himself. Turin is just making dumb decisions that are costing him. So now all that leads into what was his worldview and philosophies that led him to make these choices. Well, to start with, I think the biggest one is the philosophy of loss. Turin is, if hounded by anything, he's hounded by these consistent losses that he has to deal with early on in his life since he was a kid. His sister, his father, leaving his mother, Beleg, and Gwendor, and even to a degree Findulas, and ultimately his own sister. He's hounded by this sense of loss that he feels like he can't do anything about, and whenever he tries to do anything, it seems like he fails at it. Again, I think that's a large part to his own choices, but even then, he seems to can't escape it. And I think that Turin feels a sense of protectiveness towards others, and that his philosophy is that he needs to protect the people around him. And he, because of his ability in battle and his own passion, he is a very passionate person, despite being very cold and distant. He believes that he's the best one for the job, and that he's better at than anyone else. And honestly, he is in good position to say that, because, like I mentioned before, he is considered the most renowned warrior among humans in Middle-earth at that time. So it's not for nothing that he has his pride and his ego. But he doesn't recognize the limitations of that either. And all this being justified in the aspect of protecting those around him, whether it's his family or it's a kingdom. And it's from this mixture, this cocktail of protection and loss, that everything else tends to stem from. His own stubbornness and his anger issues that he has at being controlled, feeling like he's being controlled by fate, and that others are arguing with him or resisting him when he, quote unquote, clearly knows best. That being said, this also leads to a positive outcome, in that he has loyal to his family, and arguably much more loyal to his family than his father was. When he has a choice to choose between saving Findulas and finding his mother and his sister, he goes after his mother and sister. And what finally breaks him is when his love of his family and his passion and for protecting his family is twisted by his choices and by Morgoth, if you will. And this twistedness in his philosophy when it comes to his loyalty to his family shows up in many ways, most often in just being very hot-tempered. And, several occasions when someone says something about his family, he nearly or all out kills them. So, there's that aspect where he's clearly intelligent, he is smart, he is capable, very capable, but he has no emotional control, so to speak. It's almost like when the subject matter of his family comes up, or is threatened, or, that he can't control any aspect of that, it's like he falls back into his child self and just lashes out. Now, this isn't to say that Turin didn't believe in compassion and any of those other softer feelings. He did. And he also shows that on several occasions. In fact, he is also known for showing grief and empathy to those who have lost someone or something, and especially if he was the one directly or indirectly responsible for it. Like with Meme's son, for example, when he accidentally kills him, and he gives a dwarven vow to Meme for recompense for what he's done. So in that sense, earlier I compared him to Feanor. This is one area where he's not like Feanor at all, because Feanor can give 0 fucks, basically. And that wasn't Turin. Turin cared. It's just that Turin also had little control over his emotions. However, these traits also lead to positive aspects as well, and have some, even if it might be indirect, positive outcomes. So, for example, Turin's compassion towards people and the rage that comes with his loss also lends to him a large amount of fearlessness, like his father. He's twice was willing to stand up to Glaurung, who, again, he is well known for killing whole armies of elves. And almost everyone is afraid of this dragon. Turin has no fear of him at all, and will say shit to his face, and ultimately is the one that kills him, and he is renowned for that. So that's something that needs to be respected, as well as some of the negative stuff that has come of what he's said and done. And as I mentioned earlier, his loyalty is greater than that of his father's when it comes to his family, because Huron, to his own respect, even though he was the greatest warrior, in Middle-earth ever, and he did love his family, at the same time he spent more time with soldiers and the elves than he did with his family, so that it seems like he had a distant relationship with them. And that was not Turin. Turin cared, and maybe this was out of resentment or towards his father in that respect. I don't know. But that's another positive outcome of Turin's empathy and compassion. But, having said all that, other than loss and its branches that we just discussed, the other big thing that motivates his philosophies is his one fear, and that is his fear of fate. Turin learns from Gwendor that his father is actually still alive, decades after he had disappeared or was thought to be dead, and that Morgoth had cursed him. And that plants a seed in Turin's mind for everything else that happens, and maybe also an escape, a way to kind of cast blame on something else other than himself. Quite literally, the devil made me do it. And this seed grows into almost a kind of paranoia, to the point where he begs/demands that Gwendor not tell the elves of Nargothrond what his real name is, because he is now trying to avoid it. He's trying to live his own life without that influence on him. And he genuinely believes that if he cannot be recognized as the son of Huron, then the invisible long fingers of Morgoth will not find him. And this paranoia is so extreme that when Gwendor, out of his own frustrations because of what's going on with Turin and Nargothrond, out of frustration reveals who he actually is, and it spreads like wildfire among Nargothrond, and everyone in Nargothrond is not fearful of them. They're glad because they have this great warrior in their midst. They're happy as hell. However, Turin is not, because again, someone has spoken out loud his name, and now he is deeply afraid that fate will now find him again and continue to just fuck up his life. So this paranoia that some invisible force is out to get him is mixed and intertwined with his need to protect others around him. And the twisting and the burden of that is ultimately what finally breaks him. It twists so tight that it just snaps with the revelation of Nienor. So having said all that, there is something to be said about the philosophy of Turin's legacy, because he goes down in history not just as a tragic example of the malice of Morgoth, but also the mixture of the greatness of men and the sadness of men during that time after the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. In my video on Hurin, I had said that Hurin was the epitome of what a large number of humans in Beleriand felt before the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, when they had that long peace. And yeah, there were losses here and there. There was, the War of the Battle of Sudden Flame, etc. But by and large, they were hopeful, that the elves could help them evolve and progress their own culture and everything. Indeed, a lot of the nobles in these families and in these tribes were well learned in elvish lore, Morwen included, by the way. So, they weren't dumb or stupid. But after the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, when the forces of Morgoth have finally broken the Beleriand alliance, that hope is gone. And it is now just a matter of trying to survive. Because, again, keep in mind that all the major players, in the wars against Morgoth are scattered or dead at this point. And everyone else who's in southern Beleriand and near or around Doriath has some protection, okay, but not a great deal, because remember that Doriath was not a major participant or any participant at all during these wars because of the issues that High King Thingol had with the Noldor. So it wasn't like there was any expectation that Doriath was going to take up the mantle of taking down Morgoth. And even if they did take up the mantle, they didn't have the manpower enough to do it by this point. The Sindar elves of Doriath and the Falas were not slouches. They weren't, pissants by any means of the word. However, they were not as strong as the High Elves. That was made clear from the day that the High Elves arrived during the First War of Beleriand. That was as clear as daylight. And the only reason that Doriath survived as long as it did is because of, one, they got their armor and weapons from the dwarves, who were considered equal to, if not better than, the Noldor when it came to making weapons, and the Girdle of Million, which is basically Million's magic that just confused people and enemies who tried to enter or attack Doriath. Those are only two reasons. So, and all of those are defensive in nature. So, there's not a great deal of hope that anyone is going to take them on. The dwarves can't, because they don't have the numbers. So Turin embodies this element of survival and doing what you can to survive, to get by day and not awaken the wrath of the enemy's armies, because anytime you do, you will succeed for a time, but then you're going to get wiped out. And this is what happens with Turin, a couple times over. And yet, despite this cynicism and this post-apocalyptic world and worldview, humans are still capable of achieving great feats, i.e. the killing of Glaurung. And again, I really need to emphasize this, this is an act that only dwarves were able to do, the elves were not. And from that point of view, I can understand why later on, the Númenóreans, who are the descendants of the Edain, would look up to Turin because if they're at the point where they don't like the elves, then the story of Turin is a great lesson in terms of the quote-unquote greatness of men and of Numenor, and how what they themselves could achieve because their ancestors achieved feats that the elves were not able to do. So Turin is definitely a complicated character. His actions are complicated, his worldview is complicated, and how and or if fate actually plays a part in that is complicated. And that's why, from a philosophical point of view, in that universe, he's such an interesting character.